Welcome to Arizona Roundup with Stuart Rosebrook at Sharlot Hall Museum in Prescott, Arizona. My guest today is Paul Thies. Paul was our interim director from 2023 to 2024, and Paul currently splits his time between Prescott, Arizona and Cody, Wyoming. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you, Stuart.
Paul, it's great to have you here on Arizona Roundup, and I thought we'd sit down and talk a little bit about your career, your interest in history, your museum background, but also just a little bit about your love for Prescott, Arizona. When did you first come to the Mile High City here in Yavapai County?
Even before I probably could remember. My family was from Ajo, extreme southern Arizona. They were miners, of course, not necessarily digging the dirt, but working for Phelps Dodge. And when they retired, 1952, 53, they got out of Ajo, and both sets of grandparents moved up to the Prescott area. I already had family here. My maternal grandmother's sister and a couple of brothers lived in the Prescott area, ranched here back in the 20s and 30s. And one of them, in fact, my wife discovered this going through the list of ladies who had been memorialized in the Territorial Women's Rose Garden. One of them is memorialized there. She was a nurse who opened her own sanatorium for tubercular patients here in Prescott back in the 40s. So I was here off and on from the early 50s through the early 60s, and have a number of very vivid memories of Prescott.
Well, it sounds like it was a great idea for your grandparents to, trade saguaros for ponderosas and move up out of the Sonoran Desert. And it sounds like they sought the four seasons and the beauty of, the small town life of Prescott, Arizona in the 1950s. Well,
it's not that they were thinking about small town life. I think Prescott probably seemed like a big city to them after Ajo. Maybe even a little more relaxed than Ajo, but nonetheless, Prescott had a number of wonderful features that Ajo didn't have. One of those, of course, was the Governor's Mansion and the Governor's Mansion Museum, the Sharlot Hall Museum, and events like the rodeo and that wonderful 4th of July parade that I remember so well, the Frontier Days, when it seemed like the whole event was put on to make a kid's eyes grow wide and want to be a cowboy.
Yeah, I share some of those early memories of coming to Prescott. My first rodeo, I think, was probably 1970, and it is still one of the greatest 4th of July parades in the country. And it's still great for all ages, but for kids, it still is a wonderful parade with the sights and sounds and the horses and the drawn carriages and the Western girls and gals all ready for the rodeo. It sounds like you had some great experiences here in Prescott growing up. Was there anything that started to inspire your interest in history up here in Prescott?
I would have to say that it was storytelling, and Prescott actually figures into that. My mother always said I was interested in history because I was a breech birth and was born looking backwards. But her father, who had a place along the old Poland Road on the other side of the mountains from here, along Big Bug Creek, was a fabulous storyteller. And he had started mining. He'd started working for Phelps Dodge actually as a mechanic and a switchyard engineer and other kinds of mechanical things around the turn of the last century, and was, for example, at Bisbee in 1917 for that great wobbly strike, and told about those things in his early days in Cochise County so vividly that I grew up loving those kinds of stories and asking him to tell them over and over again, and actually incorporating those into my own stories, my own personal mythology, I guess you could say. So I think that history, which, of course, in many languages means story, is what grows out of that kind of imaginative storytelling.
Well, your grandfather definitely sounds like someone I wish I'd met, as well as your grandparents here in Prescott. It sounds like they shared quite a shared history in mining and Arizona, the first half of the 20th century, when Arizona statehood in 1912, and then the great era of copper mining and helping win the war in World War I, and the big production of copper when copper was king in Arizona.
Yeah, it sure was. And it was copper that, of course, paid the rent for both sets of grandparents. Although in the case of my father's father and mother, although she had grown up around mines because her father was a physician to miners, they spent their career trying to get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, during the 1920s, both grandparents, one grandparent, my father's father, tried being a grocer in Yuma. And my mother's father homesteaded outside of Gila Bend.
Oh, that's a tough place to homestead right there, Gila Bend.
The Vicol Valley was unforgiving in many ways, but it was a lifesaver for them in some ways too. They were in that valley a mile north of the Tucson to Yuma highway during the Great Dust Bowl years, when they saw and helped hundreds and hundreds of migrants from the eastern devastation on their way to California. Another set of those stories that I heard when I was a kid.
Well, Paul, we're going to take a small break here and hear from one of our sponsors. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about your education here in Arizona and how it took you to graduate school and a life working in museums. We'll be right back. We're back with Paul Fees, my guest this week on Arizona Roundup at Sharlot Hall Museum. My name is Stuart Rosebrook, and I'm the executive director here at Sharlot Hall. And Paul and I are talking about history, storytelling, and what inspires a career in history, which I don't think is necessarily a career that leads to,
riches,
bonanzas. But it sure does lead to a life of curiosity and interest in not only our present and sharing the stories of the past, but also inspires a lifelong curiosity in our history and heritage and culture. And if you love the Southwest, and if you lived in Prescott or visit the Prescott area, there is so much that surrounds us here that inspires our interest in history, the peoples of the great past, and as well as our present. So, Paul?
There's another aspect to history, too. In a way, it teaches problem solving. We learn by studying history the way that people encountered and overcame obstacles and solved issues and problems in their times, and that helps us understand how to confront problems and how to go about solving problems. It really is a very useful discipline, and yes, it is fueled by curiosity, and in many ways is abetted by the environment. So when we're surrounded in a place like Prescott with the kind of immediacy of our history, then we can become inspired to dig into it maybe more easily and more thoroughly than if we were in some place where the history is hidden. It's certainly visible here.
Well, I sure agree. So, Paul, when you were going to school, did you go to school here in Prescott or in Ajo?
I didn't spend a lot of time in school in Arizona. The only public school I did here was in Ajo, first grade, and a little bit in Phoenix. My father was called back into the service during the Korean War, and we ended up moving around a lot. Ajo was always the base, but we were out of state for most of my schooling.
Okay. And did you stay west when you matriculated to college? And was history on the front of your mind when you were starting to look at colleges?
In fact, it was. And I went as far west as I could. I went to college in California, a couple of apostate years at Idaho State University in Pocatello, where I did a couple of years in the pharmacy school. But from there, I was sent back, almost kicked back to Palo Alto, finished college, and began thinking about graduate school.
So you were a Stanford Cardinal.
I was, yeah, well, we called ourselves Indians in those days.
That's right,
yeah.
That's right. Today known as the Stanford Cardinal. And it's a beautiful campus. And when I walked the campus, my wife Julie also went to Stanford. It is an inspiring campus.
It is. And there's a section of it that's called History Corner, where almost all the history classes are conducted. And somehow, being part of the quadrangle, that old Spanish-style architecture, and next to what was called Memchu, the memorial church that survived the earthquake of 1906, there's an air of history there for someone like me. And there was a lot of storytelling there, too. One of my favorite contacts was a professor named Payson Treat, who was already probably in his 90s when I met him, long retired. But he had been one of the very first history professors at Stanford back around the turn of the last century, and told stories about some of the characters that people the campus over the years, like Alexander Kerensky, who was a refugee from the Russian revolutions. And so, yes, it was a great place to study history.
Are there any other historians that in the classroom that you remember that kind of inspired some of your thoughtfulness as a historian?
Stanford was blessed with some terrific history teachers. David Kennedy is one, Martin Bernstein, may not have heard of. He's a 20th century historian. And some old guys, too. I had a professor of early American history, John C. Miller, who was already nearing retirement, but had written books on the American Revolution and on James Madison and others of that period. And when he lectured, he made that period come so alive that, when we whipped the redcoats at Lexington, it made you want to stand up and cheer.
Love those kinds of professors.
Yes.
They actually inspire you to go back to the library and dig a little further. And I love your ideas about, and that history is it's an applied curriculum. It's an applied science, and it does teach us so much. And I think there's a fellow historian that both you and I know, Noel Stowe, used to always say, what question haven't you asked yet?
It's true, and that is actually the essence of studying history, is asking questions about the past, and in a museum, asking questions about the objects, the artifacts, the documents. They aren't just static. They are inspirations to our curiosity. They cry out to be questioned and to be explored. So, it goes together. History study, museums, we're in the right business.
Well, I agree with you, Paul. And we're going to take a short break here and thank our sponsors, and then come back and talk a little bit about your career in museums. Since 1995, Helken & Horn Ad Agency has helped local businesses stand out and succeed. From print and radio to websites and social media, their talented team crafts your brand's message and offers a plan to get it out into the community. Want results backed by 30 years of experience? Visit azadagency.com today. That's azadagency.com today. Helken & Horn, where their slogan is "Be Known." You're are back with Stuart Rosebrook and Paul Fees on Arizona Roundup from Sharlot Hall Museum. And Paul and I were just talking about the craft of history, the craft of writing, even the craft of curiosity. Paul, tell me a little bit about what led you from Stanford. And I believe, did you take your graduate studies at Brown University?
That's right.
That's a long ways from Ajo and Poland, Arizona.
Boy, it is.
Tell us how you got there.
I'd gone to high school for a few years in Rhode Island, had kind of fallen in love with the atmosphere of Rhode Island, Providence, Newport, the whaling towns of New Bedford and Nantucket, and I'm kind of a Moby Dick fan, you know. Anyway, after...
You've seen your ties, Paul. They're famous.
After finishing Stanford, Nancy and I spent another year or so in Palo Alto, just thinking about our options, and then had the opportunity. Brown accepted me into the American Studies program, American Civ it was called there, and we were off. Didn't look back. Ran into terrific mentors there who were so encouraging, and whose own work was so fascinating and so deep in American history. And it also was a place that's surrounded by an older history than we have here, for the most part. Certainly an older American history, U.S. history. And I went back there with the idea of becoming a labor historian because of my grandfather's stories about Bisbee and Ajo and copper strikes. And the longer I was there, the farther back I went. And if I'd spent another 5 years in graduate school, I'd probably be doing ancient Rome and Greece. But I ended up doing the early American movement West as my field of study and my dissertation, and loved it. And went from there to museum work, almost by accident. But, one of my mentors there was a museum director who made it seem like an awfully fun way to engage with the past.
Well, that reminds me of Noel Stowe, of course, as someone who really emphasized to all of us on how to apply your knowledge and curiosity of history to a career. Tell me a little bit about that dissertation, some of the writing you did, and obviously growing up in the West and then finding yourself on the East Coast in grad school, you're looking back west, great perspective. Whereas you're writing about New Englanders who, saddled up and crowded their wagons and went west?
Yeah, exactly. I really became really I just couldn't get away from the Westward movement as it was first unfolding during the French and Indian Wars and after. But I particularly liked the stories of one of my childhood heroes, Mad Anthony Wayne, in the old Northwest, not the Pacific Northwest. The Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Treaty of Greenville, the Trail of Tears, which became one of the areas of study of my dissertation advisor, and from there to revitalization movements such as the Ghost Dance. The New England image of the Old Northwest is what I first started studying, and ways in which the West became part of the consciousness of New Englanders and other Americans. The West was so exotic at first that it couldn't be really American until it became internalized by Easterners.
Right.
And so that was the focus of my early study. And again, like I said, from there, because of the way it grew into studies of Indian, like I said, revitalization movements, and the ways in which it tied in with American religious history and American urban history and for that matter, linguistics. There's so many different facets to history that can be brought to bear and were illustrated by and illuminated by the study of the American West and the movement West that I just didn't stop being a student.
So when you were there in Rhode Island and you finished up your doctorate at Brown, did you and Nancy stay on the East Coast, or did you find yourself with an early opportunity back west, your own westward movement?
I was kind of the designated Westerner in my department, and so anything about the West, whether it was a poster from a conference, whatever it happened to be, that came to somebody else in the department, faculty or students, they'd stick into my mailbox. And one day I found an advertisement for a museum job in Wyoming. The opportunity just seemed too fun to ignore, so I wrote off for it. You did it all by snail mail in those days.
Of course.
And by golly, they invited me out for an interview, and I found Cody, Wyoming to be just a perfect place to land. And the museum at the other end was a place called the Buffalo Bill Historical Center. And in a town of, at that time, 5,500, the Historical Center, which was an enormous edifice, huge and varied collections, was such a surprise that again, it became something to which it just was bigger than any of us could have expected. And so my career as a museum person took root there. And because it was such a big and rich place, with a large staff, with varied and deep collections of all facets of Western history and technology, I just really thrived in that atmosphere. I became, to my horror, for a while, the world's greatest authority on Buffalo Bill. But he never got boring either. So I don't think there's anything boring about Buffalo Bill Cody. No, but the opportunities for exploration in the museum world was so rich with Plains Indians and firearms and art and the various aspects of Western history that I was there for 20 years, and from there went on to be able to create, for example, the Annie Oakley Center at a museum in Ohio, in Greenville, Ohio, the Garst Museum, which had the added attraction, of course, of being the creation of General Wayne, who had been one of my childhood heroes, and also to help with the establishment of museum programs in Texas and in Kentucky. I've never gotten bored with it. Well, we're going to hear a little bit more in our last segment here as we take a break and thank our sponsors. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about Buffalo Bill, Sharlot Hall, what if they ever met, and what you're reading right now. So we'll be back with Paul Fees on Arizona Roundup at Sharlot Hall Museum. If you're looking for the store that has everything, Prescott True Value Hardware might be your answer. From having that part to fix that leaky faucet to decorating your garden with charm, they've got it all, and a friendly face to match. For over 30 years, they've proudly served Prescott, supporting neighbors like you and local nonprofits along the way. Visit Prescott True Value Hardware. They're more than just a hardware store. This is Stuart Rosebrook at Arizona Roundup at Sharlot Hall Museum in Prescott, Arizona, and my guest this week is Paul Fees, and we've been having a great time talking about history,
Buffalo Bill, how someone discovers their path to a career in history. And just before the break, I threw out the idea that what it would have been like if Buffalo Bill and Sharlot Hall herself had met, and maybe there was even a possibility that they did.
You know, it's not inconceivable. Buffalo Bill spent a great deal of time here, 1909 to 1912. And in fact, he was such an Arizona character by that time because of his investments in Oracle.
Just north of Tucson?
Right, just outside of Tucson. Ranching and mining opportunities there. And the establishment of what he called the Hijinks Ranch outside of Oracle. He spent so much time there, though, that he was actually mentioned in some of the Arizona newspapers as being a candidate to be one of the first senators.
How about that?
With statehood, 1912. And
well, she would have been aware of him, that's for sure.
The newspapers, all the eastern newspapers that got wind of this, of course, all made kind of light of it. And they thought, well, yeah, he'd be a rootin' toot. He'd shoot them up. You know, he'd not stand for any nonsense in Congress. And they'd have political cartoons of him with the six-shooters. But he was interested enough in Arizona affairs that it's quite possible that he and Sharlot met. And it's even possible that she might have interviewed him. I haven't looked through her papers deeply enough to know, but she was such a serious Arizona historian by that time, of course, that she'd have been interested in the same things that he was interested in.
Well, I'm imagining right now a round table like the one we're sitting at, with Sharlot Hall, who was not shy of men, with Buffalo Bill, Tom Mix, and President Theodore Roosevelt. And she would have held court with those three, no problem.
No problem. And you know what? She always had a fascination for older men. I think there's something there.
Well, Paul, tell us a little bit about something you did at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West that continues to inspire you today as a museum professional and as a historian, and something that you consider as kind of a model of your career in museums and as a professional historian.
Well, a lot of my time was spent developing exhibitions that grew out of our collections largely. Some of them were topical, though. The creation of an Indian memorial at the Little Bighorn Battlefield, for example, was the inspiration for one of our exhibitions that I put together.
It's a beautiful memorial, by the way.
Oh, it is. And at the time, there was a great deal of opposition to it from old-time Custer buffs, but they're all quiet now because it is such a moving and important part of that battlefield now.
And I would just throw in real quickly that if you're going to make a trip on your bucket list in the West, Little Bighorn National Monument.
Boy, I'll say. It's a place that is not haunted, but there's so much feeling there. You can get such a sense of the passions that were expended on both sides during that campaign that you cannot come away without being changed in some way. It really engages you, even if there's nothing going on. Just the landscape grabs you.
There's a quiet solace as you open the car door and step out that envelops you.
It's true.
Really powerful.
It's true. It's true. The story is there. It's all around you. You cannot help but being engaged in it.
So Paul, if you were going to bring someone over to the Sharlot Hall Museum and take a tour, and you wanted to share something with them about Sharlot Hall herself, where would you start and where would you end?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think I'd start right with the little set of objects of hers that are in the lobby of the Lawler. It's not quite a shrine. It's not fully explicative either. It's a sampling of the things of her life, but it really can't give you an impression of how hard she worked to make her life work. For that, you have to go to the governor's mansion and imagine her there in 1927, 28, with the place covered in dirt, with the ruins of the commercial laundry that had operated out of there for a while, and think about the elbow grease that she put into making it habitable, and finally as a worthy place for the collection of artifacts that she had put together. She was someone who worked, and with always a focus on the story. She was a fabulous storyteller in her poetry, her essays, and obviously in her museum work. The great Western artist Maynard Dixon spent time with her on her ranch in 1900, her orchard ranch outside of Prescott, and said that she was in her way a heroine, and she was, and her efforts were heroic. Her backbone, while her back was always troubled because of an accident as a child, her backbone itself was stiff and tough, and she faced life head on. And she let nothing get in the way of her accomplishing the things that she wanted to accomplish to make Arizona history accessible to people, while at the same time she wanted to be sure to save the things of Arizona history. She was a remarkable person. We couldn't call her a feminist necessarily. She just was a strong woman who was so focused on her goal of creating a lasting memorial, and so prescient, so insightful in the things that would be necessary to make it work and to sustain it after her death, that she's a model for us.
So if you were going to have dinner with Sharlot Hall, Paul, what would be one of the first things you'd ask her over a meal?
I'd want to know a little more about her personal life. She hid her personal life, and in fact she had most of her personal correspondence destroyed after she died. I'd like to know a little bit more about how she felt about things outside of her passion for storytelling and history. She's a real mystery to us. There's a lot to learn, and a lot more to learn about Sharlot.
Yes, there is. And she was quite a learned, self-taught woman, very well read. Her writings and her poetry were read across the country. Good friend with Charles Lummis and a literati group here out west. They published quite a bit together.
And her personal library, which is preserved in our research center here at Sharlot Hall Museum, is a revelation too. Her reading was eclectic and deep. When you sample the books from her shelves, you see that she made notes and underlinings and stuck paper here and there. She was a devourer of history, of philosophy. She was a free thinker, and was also on, in some ways, the cutting edge of American literature at the time. Her poetry, believe it or not, was reviewed favorably in the New York Times in 1911. Extraordinary for a little ranch girl from Dewey.
Yeah, it sure is. Now, we know that you're a very big fan of Herman Melville and his classic Moby Dick. But when you were at Stanford, was Wallace Stegner there at the time?
No, Wallace Stegner, he was living outside of Palo Alto.
Okay.
But I never met him. I met his daughter, but not Wallace Stegner himself. But certainly he was a big presence. And storytelling was a big deal there, of course. The Wallace Stegner Fellowships brought some of the finest writers in America to Stanford. And I got to take courses with a couple of them. So he was a presence, just not necessarily on the spot.
Right. Is there anything I'm going to put you on the spot here. Is there anything by Stegner you'd recommend that we read? And what are you reading right now? Or is there a classic Western history that you think that everyone should read?
Well, I'm a big favor in this state. I'm a big favor of everything Reg Manning wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Stegner's best known for a book called Angle of Repose, I think. But that was based on a memoir by Isabella Bird. Anyway, it's called a Gentlewoman in the Rockies or something like that. And so it's not his most creative or even insightful work. I think his biography of Joe Hill, to me, is in many ways his best work. That's the Joe Hill, who was the radical labor guy who was executed in Utah. And somehow he makes Joe Hill's struggles, the struggles of all Westerners against the environment, of course, of the time, but also the forces of repression and injustice. It's a terrific story, and it's beautifully told.
So what are you reading right now, Paul, before we close out this week's Arizona Roundup? Are you reading any? Have you gone back to read something that you haven't read in a while, or is there a new book on your nightstand?
I most recently finished a book about Lincoln. I never tire of reading about Lincoln and the Civil War, as probably most history buffs do. But it was it's a book that's in the Prescott Public Library, actually, in case anyone's interested, called Chorus of the Union, about the relationship between Douglas and Lincoln, and how if we could go back in time, their debates would have been known as the Douglas-Lincoln debates rather than the Lincoln-Douglas debates, because of the imbalance in their fame at the beginning of their association, but also how Douglas, even though he was an opponent, how he put his own ambitions and his own ideological directions aside in order to save the Union, and how he became important in that way to bringing people to Lincoln's side at the beginning of Lincoln's presidency. You know, he held Lincoln's hat for Lincoln during the inaugural speech and only died a few months later, so he didn't get to see much of what he had accomplished. But by doing what he did, he made the Union stronger and made the reconciliation between Democrats and Republicans to make the Union victorious at the beginning of the Civil War.
Well, Paul, I'm going to look for that book myself, and I'm going to look for you to be back on the Arizona Roundup here in just a couple of weeks. We're going to get you back on the show, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about men like Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt, and women like Sharlot Hall and Grace Sparks, and many of the others who helped build this country and our Western culture. And we're gonna have time to have a whole series of conversations here, Paul. So
that sounds like fun, and we can always find an Arizona link to those topics.
We sure can. And as we're coming up on our 250th, we can talk a little bit about the legacy of the Prescott family and the Prescott name, and here in Prescott, Arizona, everybody's hometown. This is Stuart Rosebrook from Arizona Roundup at Sharlot Hall Museum. See you next week. For over 45 years, Blind Brothers Arizona has been the heart of window style in Prescott. From blinds, shutters, drapes, they custom design and install with expert precision. Tailored to you, whether for your home or office, trust the name locals rely on. Visit blindbrothersaz.com today or call 928-776-1845. That's blindbrothersaz.com at 928-776-1845 for a free consultation. Blind Brothers Arizona, the original since 1979.
Well, that's a wrap, folks, and we thank you very much for joining us for Arizona Roundup, coming your way from the mile-high cowboy city, Prescott, Arizona, everybody's hometown. The Sharlot Hall Museum is just one of the many attractions in this fine cowboy city, so we encourage you to make a stop when you're in the arena sometime. You'll be glad you did. Hey, we would invite you to, again, take care by looking at the Sharlot Hall Museum. And it's a place to visit when you come to Prescott, but there's a lot of good stuff that you can find on the website. So charlottehallmuseum.org, charlottehallmuseum.org. Check us out and look at the events that are coming, and there might be something just for you to do right here. I'm Stan Houston for the Cowboy Spirit Radio Network, and it's our privilege and pleasure to bring this program to you. And by the way, if you'd like to know more about how you could have your own radio program with a Western touch, we'd be glad to talk to you. Just reach out to me at stanhouston@gmail.com, stanhouston@gmail.com. Stuart and all of the people at the Sharlot Hall Museum are having a wonderful time because they are now on worldwide radio, and you can be so too. So all the best and blessings to you. Take care, and join us again next week for Arizona Roundup.